Rachel Simmons adjusted the collar of her designer coat as she stepped out of the sleek glass building that housed her downtown Cleveland law firm. The October wind carried the scent of Lake Erie and the distant promise of snow, cutting through the urban canyon between the skyscrapers, with a sharpness that made her pull the expensive wool tighter around her shoulders. At 32, she had built a life of careful precision. A corner office on the 23rd floor, a penthouse apartment in the warehouse district, and a reputation for winning cases that others deemed unwinnable. Yet as she walked toward her reserved parking spot, the familiar weight of solitude pressed against her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. The law firm's holiday charity drive had been her idea, though she approached it with the same calculated efficiency she brought to depositions. Corporate social responsibility looked good on the firm's website, and it provided tax benefits that made the partners smile during quarterly meetings. She had delegated the actual organization to her assistant, signing checks and approving donation drives without much thought to where the money went or who it helped. Charity was a line item, a necessary component of maintaining her professional image in a city that still remembered when she was nobody special. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother asking if she would come to Thanksgiving dinner next month. Rachel stared at the message for a long moment before sliding the device back into her purse without responding. The thought of sitting around her childhood dining room table, pretending that success had filled all the empty spaces in her life, felt more exhausting than a week of trials. Her mother still lived in the same modest house in Lakewood where Rachel had grown up. Where money had always been tight and second-hand, everything was the norm. The memory of those years felt foreign now, like recalling someone else's life. She remembered the embarrassment of wearing donated clothes to school, the careful way her mother would remove tags and wash everything twice to make it seem new. Most of all, she remembered the brown wool coat that had been too big for her 10-year-old frame, with sleeves that hung past her wrists and shoulders that drooped like a disappointed sigh. Her mother had sewn her name into the inside pocket, a precaution against loss that had felt more like a mark of shame. Rachel Ann Simmons, written in careful cursive with navy thread, had seemed to announce to the world that she was the kind of child who needed her name sewn into clothes because nothing truly belonged to her. When they had finally saved enough money for a new coat the following winter, her mother had insisted they donate the brown one to charity. Rachel had watched it disappear into a collection bin outside their church, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness. The coat had kept her warm, but it had also been a daily reminder of everything they couldn't afford, everything that made her different from her classmates who arrived at school in clothes that actually fit. Now, as she approached the intersection of East 9th and Euclid, Rachel found herself thinking about that coat for the first time in years. The memory felt sharp and unwelcome, like stepping on glass in bare feet. She was no longer that girl who wore other people's cast-offs and tried to make herself invisible in school hallways. She had worked 70-hour weeks through law school, had clawed her way up from a public defender's office to one of the most prestigious firms in the city. She drove a BMW that cost more than her mother's annual income, and she had earned every symbol of success through relentless determination. The crosswalk light changed, and Rachel stepped into the street alongside a crowd of downtown workers heading home for the evening. The sidewalk smelled of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart and exhaust from the evening traffic, mixing with the crisp autumn air in a way that was distinctly urban. She moved with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this world of glass towers and expensive restaurants, her heels clicking against the concrete with a rhythm that spoke of purpose and direction. It was then that she saw him. He stood at the bus stop on the corner, leaning against the metal shelter with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. His clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested recent weight loss, and his shoes were worn thin at the heels. But it was the coat that stopped her mid-step, that sent a shock of recognition through her chest like ice water in her veins. Brown wool, slightly faded but still intact, with sleeves that were now too short for adult arms, and a hemline that hit at an awkward length above the knees. The same coat she remembered from her childhood, impossible as it seemed, familiar down to the small stain near the left pocket that had never quite come out in the wash. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, a mixture of disbelief and mounting irritation. The rational part of her mind insisted it couldn't be the same coat. Thousands of similar garments had been manufactured, donated, circulated through charity networks. But the sight of it triggered something primitive and defensive, a reaction that bypassed logic entirely. This man was wearing what looked like her childhood shame, displaying it publicly in a way that felt like a violation of privacy she hadn't known she still guarded. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, with greying hair that needed cutting and a face marked by the kind of weariness that came from sustained hardship. His eyes held a distant quality, focused on something beyond the immediate street scene, and he clutched a worn paper bag that might have contained his lunch or his only possessions. There was a dignity in the way he held himself, despite his circumstances, a refusal to disappear that commanded a certain respect. But Rachel found herself unable to see past the coat, unable to process anything beyond the flood of unwelcome memories it triggered. Without quite meaning to, she found herself approaching the bus stop. Her heart hammered against her ribs with an intensity that surprised her, and she could taste something metallic in her mouth. The words came out before she could stop them, emerging from some dark place she hadn't known still existed within her. She told him that he looked ridiculous in that old thing, that it was clearly too small, and made him appear even more pathetic than he probably was already. The words felt foreign in her mouth even as she spoke them, cruel in a way that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She suggested that if he was going to be homeless, he might at least try to maintain some dignity, might consider finding clothes that actually fit instead of parading around in obvious hand-me-downs. The man looked up at her with an expression that was neither angry nor defensive, but rather surprised and somehow sad. He didn't respond immediately, seeming to process not just her words, but the venom behind them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and carried the careful modulation of someone who had learned to diffuse conflict through gentleness. He said he was sorry if his appearance offended her, that he understood she was probably having a difficult day. The coat, he explained, had been given to him by a shelter when his previous one had been stolen, and he was grateful for anything that could keep him warm as winter approached. Rachel felt the man's response like a physical blow, the kindness in his words somehow more devastating than anger would have been. She realized that people on the street were staring, that her outburst had created exactly the kind of public spectacle she normally went to great lengths to avoid. A woman pushing a stroller had paused to watch, her expression one of disgust that seemed directed entirely at Rachel. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head as he passed, clearly categorizing her as exactly the kind of person who gave successful professionals a bad reputation. The shame hit her with surprising force, though she couldn't quite identify its source. She muttered something about being late for an appointment and turned to leave, her face burning with embarrassment and confusion. But as she took her first step away from the bus stop, she heard the man say something that stopped her completely. He mentioned that the coat was special to him because someone had taken the time to sew a name inside the pocket, a small kindness that made him feel less alone in the world. He said he sometimes touched the embroidered name when he was having a particularly difficult day, imagining the child who had once worn it and hoping she had grown up to be happy and successful. Rachel turned back toward him with movements that felt disconnected from her conscious will. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper when she asked what name was sewn inside the pocket. The man looked slightly puzzled by her interest, but reached into the coat's interior with fingers that trembled slightly from cold or nervousness. He withdrew his hand carefully and said the name was Rachel Ann Simmons, sewn in navy blue thread in what looked like a mother's careful handwriting. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rachel felt her knees weaken and had to reach out to steady herself against the bus stop shelter. The sounds of traffic became muffled and distant, replaced by the rushing sensation of blood in her ears. She stared at the man with new eyes, seeing not just his worn clothes and tired face, but the impossible coincidence that had brought them together on this particular corner, on this particular evening. The man noticed her distress and asked if she was all right, reaching out with an instinctive gesture of concern before stopping himself, perhaps remembering her earlier hostility. His expression had shifted to one of genuine worry, the kind of natural compassion that couldn't be faked or learned. Rachel realized she was breathing too quickly and forced herself to slow down, to process what was happening with the analytical mind that served her so well in courtrooms. She asked him where he had gotten the coat, her voice steadier now, but still carrying an undertone of urgency that seemed to puzzle him. He explained that he had been staying at a shelter on the west side for the past few months, that they had a donation room where residents could find clothes and basic necessities. The coat had been hanging there for weeks, passed over by other residents because of its small size and dated style. He had claimed it only because winter was coming, and his previous coat had been stolen while he slept in a doorway downtown. Rachel found herself asking more questions, details that probably seemed random to him but were crucial to her growing understanding. When had he first come to the shelter? How long had the coat been in the donation room? Did he know anything about where it had come from originally? The man answered patiently, perhaps recognizing something desperate in her questioning that transcended normal curiosity. The shelter, he explained, had been receiving donations from various sources for years: churches, community groups, individual families cleaning out closets. The clothes came from all over the greater Cleveland area and beyond. There was no systematic tracking of where specific items originated, no way to trace the journey of a single brown wool coat through the network of charity organizations that served the city's homeless population. The coat could have been donated yesterday or 20 years ago, could have passed through multiple shelters and distribution points before ending up in the room where he had found it. As he spoke, Rachel began to calculate time frames and possibilities. Her mother had donated the coat in 1998, when Rachel was 11 years old. That meant it had been circulating through Cleveland's charity network for over 20 years, potentially keeping dozens of people warm through harsh Ohio winters. The thought created a strange sensation in her chest, something that might have been pride, mixed with a grief she couldn't quite identify. The man was looking at her with increasing concern, clearly wondering why a well-dressed woman would show such intense interest in the provenance of his second-hand coat. Rachel realized she needed to explain, though she wasn't sure how to begin. The story felt too personal, too complicated to share with a stranger at a bus stop. But something about his patient attention, his willingness to answer her questions despite her earlier cruelty, made her feel safe enough to try. She told him that her name was Rachel Simmons, speaking the words slowly and watching his face change as understanding dawned. She explained that the coat had once been hers, that her mother had sewn her name inside the pocket when she was 10 years old, and they couldn't afford anything new. She had worn it through one difficult winter, had felt both grateful for its warmth and embarrassed by its obvious second-hand status. When her family finally replaced it the following year, they had donated it to charity, never imagining it would continue protecting people for decades to come. The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, amazement, and something that looked like wonder. He reached inside the coat again, this time pulling the pocket open so she could see the name embroidered there, Rachel Ann Simmons, exactly as her mother had stitched it more than 20 years ago, the navy thread slightly faded, but still clearly legible. Seeing her childhood name in her mother's careful handwriting created an unexpected tightness in her throat. He asked if she was certain, if she was sure this was really her coat from childhood. The question was gentle, tinged with the kind of careful hope that comes from expecting disappointment but wanting to believe in small miracles anyway. Rachel found herself describing details she hadn't thought about in years. The small stain near the left pocket where she had spilled chocolate milk. The way the right sleeve had been slightly longer than the left. The particular shade of brown that had reminded her of fallen leaves. With each detail the man nodded, confirming that these imperfections were indeed present on the coat he wore. The bus arrived with a hydraulic wheeze and opened its doors, but neither of them moved to board. Other waiting passengers flowed around them, casting curious glances at the unlikely pair deep in conversation at the shelter. Rachel realized she was no longer thinking about getting to her car, no longer focused on the evening routine that normally structured her life. Something larger was happening here, something that demanded her complete attention. The man introduced himself as Henry Clark, extending a hand that was calloused but clean. Rachel shook it, noticing the careful way he held himself, the dignity that persisted despite his circumstances. She found herself apologizing for her earlier behavior, the words emerging more easily than she had expected. She admitted that seeing the coat had triggered emotions she didn't fully understand. Memories of a time when she had felt powerless and ashamed. She had lashed out at him because he represented something she had spent years trying to forget about herself. Henry accepted her apology with a grace that made her earlier cruelty seem even more shameful by comparison. He said he understood that everyone carried burdens that weren't visible from the outside, that pain could make people say things they didn't really mean. His own story, he shared, involved losing his job as a maintenance worker when the office building where he worked was sold and renovated. Unable to afford rent without steady income, he had gradually fallen through the cracks of the social safety net, ending up on the streets despite his best efforts to maintain employment and housing. As Henry spoke, Rachel found herself really listening in a way she hadn't done in years. Her professional life had conditioned her to analyze information quickly, to categorize people based on their utility to her cases or career. But standing at the bus stop, learning about this man's life while wearing the coat that had once sheltered her own childhood vulnerability, she felt something shifting in her perspective. The details of his struggle were specific and human. The night he spent awake in a 24-hour laundromat because it was warm and safe, the way he saved part of every meal in case he couldn't find food the next day, the complicated process of maintaining hope when every day brought new challenges to basic survival. Another bus came and went. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows between the downtown buildings and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the glass towers surrounding them. Rachel realized she should be heading home, that she had work to review for tomorrow's meetings. But something kept her rooted to this spot, engaged in a conversation that felt more real than any interaction she'd had in months. She asked Henry about the shelter, about what his days were like, about what he hoped for in the future. His answers revealed a man who had maintained his humanity despite circumstances that might have broken others. He volunteered in the shelter's kitchen when he could, helping prepare meals for residents who were struggling even more than he was. He spent time at the public library, reading and sometimes helping other patrons with computer questions. He was waiting for a callback from a possible job opportunity, a maintenance position at a hospital that might offer both steady work and health benefits. The more Henry shared about his life, the more Rachel began to see the strange poetry in their meeting. The coat that had once represented her family's financial struggles had continued its mission, of providing warmth and dignity to those who needed it most. Henry wore it not with shame, but with gratitude, appreciating the unknown hands that had sewn the name inside as a gesture of love and care. He had transformed what had once been a source of embarrassment for young Rachel into something meaningful and even beautiful. As darkness settled over the city, Rachel found herself suggesting something that surprised them both. She asked if Henry would join her for dinner, explaining that she knew a place nearby that served good food and wouldn't make judgments about appearance. The invitation emerged spontaneously, driven by a desire to extend their conversation beyond the confines of the bus stop, to learn more about this man who carried a piece of her history without knowing it. Henry hesitated, clearly weighing the offer against past experiences that might have taught him caution about accepting invitations from strangers. But something in Rachel's tone, perhaps the genuine curiosity that had replaced her earlier hostility, seemed to convince him. He accepted quietly, asking only that they choose somewhere that wouldn't make her uncomfortable to be seen with him. They walked together toward a small cafe Rachel knew in the theatre district, a place that stayed open late and attracted a diverse crowd of artists, night workers, and downtown residents. The conversation continued as they moved through the cooling evening, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Rachel found herself telling Henry about her work, about the cases she handled, and the satisfaction she derived from fighting for clients who faced overwhelming odds. In return, he shared stories from his years as a maintenance worker, the quiet pride he took in fixing things that were broken, in making spaces clean and functional for the people who used them. The cafe welcomed them without comment, seating them at a corner table where they could continue talking without drawing attention. Over soup and sandwiches, Rachel learned more about Henry's life before homelessness. A failed marriage that had ended amicably, adult children who lived across the country and didn't know about his current circumstances, his decision to shield them from worry by not asking for help. He spoke about his situation matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but also without minimizing the daily challenges he faced. Rachel shared some of her own story, describing the drive that had pushed her through law school and into her current position. She talked about the loneliness of success, the way achievement could become a fortress that kept others at bay, as much as it protected her from the vulnerabilities of her past. She admitted that she hadn't maintained close relationships with people from her childhood, that success had somehow required leaving behind the version of herself who had needed help from others. As the evening progressed, Rachel began to understand something about the strange coincidence that had brought them together. The coat represented more than just a shared object from her past. It embodied the interconnected nature of human kindness, the way acts of generosity could ripple outward in ways that were impossible to predict or track. Her mother's decision to donate rather than discard the coat had created a chain of warmth that had lasted decades, touching lives in ways they would never fully know. Henry mentioned that he often thought about the child whose name was sewn inside the pocket, wondered what had become of her, and whether she remembered the coat fondly or with embarrassment. Learning that she had grown up to become a successful attorney seemed to validate something he had hoped about the power of small kindnesses to contribute to larger transformations. He said it gave him hope about his own situation, the possibility that current hardships might eventually lead to something better. The conversation gradually shifted toward more personal territory. Rachel found herself describing the emptiness she had felt despite her professional success, the way achievement had failed to fill certain voids in her life. She talked about the distance that had grown between her and her mother, The guilt she felt about avoiding family gatherings and phone calls. Success had required her to become someone harder and more self-sufficient than the child who had once worn Henry's coat, but in the process she had lost touch with parts of herself that she was only now realizing she missed. Henry listened with the kind of attention that was itself a gift, responding to her words with understanding rather than judgment. He shared his own reflections on identity and change, describing how losing his job and home had forced him to reconsider what truly mattered in life. The experience had stripped away many of the external markers he had used to define himself, leaving him with a clearer sense of his core values and priorities. In some ways, he suggested, his current difficulties had taught him things about resilience and community that he might never have learned otherwise. As the cafe began to empty and the staff started cleaning tables around them, Rachel realized she didn't want the evening to end. Something important was happening in this conversation, something that felt like it might change her if she allowed it to continue. She asked Henry about his plans for the night, learning that he would return to the shelter where he had a bed assignment through the end of the month. After that, he would need to reapply and hope for continued placement, a process that created constant uncertainty about basic safety and shelter. The precariousness of Henry's situation struck Rachel with unexpected force. This man, who had treated her with kindness despite her initial cruelty, who had worn her childhood coat with dignity for months without knowing its significance, faced the daily possibility of sleeping outdoors as winter approached. The contrast between her secure penthouse apartment and his uncertain access to basic shelter felt not just unfair, but somehow personal, connected to her through the shared history of the brown wool coat. An idea began forming in Rachel's mind, something that felt both impulsive and necessary. She started to speak, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was considering without sounding condescending or creating an uncomfortable power dynamic. But the thought of Henry returning to the shelter while she went home to her empty apartment felt increasingly wrong, like a missed opportunity for something meaningful. She told Henry that she had a guest room in her apartment, that it was furnished and unused most of the time. She suggested that he might stay there temporarily while he looked for work and permanent housing, emphasizing that the arrangement would be mutually beneficial since she often traveled for cases and appreciated having someone to watch the place. The offer emerged carefully, structured to preserve his dignity while acknowledging the practical reality of his situation. Henry's response was cautious, reflecting what appeared to be a lifetime of carefully managing pride and need. He thanked her for the offer, but expressed concern about accepting charity from someone he had just met, regardless of their strange connection through the coat. He worried about creating obligations or expectations that might complicate what had been a meaningful encounter. His reluctance seemed rooted not in suspicion, but in the kind of self-respect that had helped him maintain his humanity despite difficult circumstances. Rachel found herself explaining that her offer came not from pity, but from recognition of something valuable in their conversation. She admitted that she had been feeling isolated despite her success, that their meeting had reminded her of aspects of human connection she had forgotten how to cultivate. Having Henry as a temporary house guest might help her as much as it helped him, providing a reason to engage more fully with life beyond her work obligations. The discussion continued as they left the cafe and walked slowly back toward the bus stop where they had first encountered each other. The night air had grown colder, carrying the promise of Cleveland's approaching winter. Rachel noticed how Henry pulled the brown coat closer around himself, appreciating anew its role in protecting him from the elements. The sight created a complex emotion in her chest, something between gratitude and responsibility. They stood together at the same bus stop where the evening had begun, but the dynamic between them had transformed completely. Where there had been hostility and misunderstanding, there was now genuine connection and mutual respect. The coat that had initially triggered Rachel's defensive reaction now seemed like a bridge between their different worlds, a tangible reminder that their lives had been connected long before they met. Henry eventually agreed to accept Rachel's offer on a temporary basis, establishing clear boundaries and expectations that would allow him to maintain his dignity while accepting help. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet the following evening so she could show him the apartment and they could discuss practical arrangements. The conversation felt businesslike but warm, structured around mutual respect rather than charity or pity. As Henry's bus finally arrived, Rachel found herself feeling reluctant to end their time together. The evening had created something unexpected and valuable, a connection that transcended their different circumstances and backgrounds. She watched him board the bus, still wearing the brown coat that had brought them together, and felt a sense of anticipation about continuing their acquaintance. Walking to her car, Rachel reflected on the strange turns her evening had taken. What had begun as a routine day at the law firm had evolved into an encounter that challenged many of her assumptions about success, charity, and human connection. The coat that had once represented childhood shame had become a vehicle for adult understanding, creating opportunities for growth that neither she nor Henry could have anticipated. The drive home took her through neighborhoods that looked different now that she had spent the evening hearing about life from Henry's perspective. She noticed details she had previously overlooked: people waiting at bus stops, individuals who might be experiencing homelessness, the complex ecosystem of urban survival that existed parallel to her professional world. The city felt more real and more connected, less like a collection of separate experiences and more like an interconnected web of human stories. In her apartment that night, Rachel called her mother for the first time in months. The conversation began awkwardly, with the familiar tension that had developed over years of avoided phone calls and missed family gatherings. But as Rachel shared the story of meeting Henry and recognizing the donated coat, something shifted between them. Her mother remembered the brown coat clearly, remembered sewing Rachel's name inside with careful stitches, and hopes that it would keep her daughter warm and safe. Learning that the coat had continued serving others for more than 20 years created unexpected emotion for both women. Rachel's mother spoke about her decision to donate rather than discard items they no longer needed, explaining that she had always hoped their cast-offs might help families facing similar struggles. The brown coat had represented not just Rachel's childhood necessity, but her mother's faith in the power of small acts of kindness to create positive ripples in the world. The conversation with her mother continued longer than any they had shared in years, touching on subjects they had both been avoiding. Rachel apologized for the distance she had created in pursuit of professional success, acknowledging that her achievements felt incomplete without meaningful connections to sustain them. Her mother expressed pride in Rachel's accomplishments while also sharing her own feelings of loss about their diminished relationship. They made tentative plans for Rachel to visit the following weekend, the first time she would return to her childhood home in over a year. The prospect created both anxiety and anticipation, a recognition that rebuilding their relationship would require sustained effort from both sides. But the conversation about the brown coat had created an opening, a shared understanding that their family's history contained both struggles and strengths worth preserving. The following evening, Rachel met Henry at the agreed location and drove him to her apartment building. The transition felt significant for both of them. Henry's first night in stable housing in months. Rachel's first experience sharing her carefully controlled living space with another person. The guest room had remained unused since she moved in, furnished but somehow lifeless, waiting for purpose. Henry's presence in the apartment created immediate changes that surprised Rachel with their positive impact. The space felt more alive with another person moving through it, more like a home and less like an elegant storage facility for her possessions. They established routines that respected each other's privacy while creating opportunities for continued conversation and connection. Over the following days and weeks, their arrangement evolved naturally. Henry found part-time work through a temporary employment agency, contributing to household expenses and saving money for permanent housing. Rachel discovered that having a housemate motivated her to spend more time in her apartment, to cook actual meals instead of surviving on takeout and coffee shop pastries. Their evening conversations became a highlight of her day, providing perspective and companionship that had been missing from her life. The brown coat occupied a special place in their developing friendship, hanging in the guest room closet like a tangible reminder of the forces that had brought them together. Henry had acquired other clothing through his temporary work, but he continued to wear the coat occasionally, particularly on cold mornings when he walked to job interviews or meetings with social services agencies. Rachel had grown to love seeing him in it, appreciating the way he carried her childhood garment with dignity and gratitude. As autumn progressed toward winter, Rachel found herself changing in ways that went beyond her living situation. Her work remained important and demanding, but it no longer consumed her entire identity. She began accepting social invitations she would previously have declined, started calling her mother regularly, and even made plans to attend family gatherings she had avoided for years. Henry's perspective on resilience and community had influenced her approach to relationships, teaching her that vulnerability and interdependence could be sources of strength rather than weakness. Henry's situation also improved steadily. The stable housing had given him an address to use on job applications, a place to shower and maintain his appearance, and the psychological security that comes from knowing where you will sleep each night. His part-time work led to a full-time opportunity with benefits, restoring his financial independence and self-sufficiency. But more than practical improvements, his friendship with Rachel had provided something equally valuable, a reminder that human connection could transcend circumstantial differences and create meaning beyond individual survival. One evening in late November, as they sat together in Rachel's living room reviewing Henry's lease application for his own apartment, Rachel realized how much her life had changed since their meeting at the bus stop. The loneliness that had characterized her professional success had been replaced by a sense of connection that extended beyond her relationship with Henry, to include renewed bonds with family and tentative new friendships with colleagues and neighbors. The brown coat hung in the guest room closet, waiting for Henry's move to his new apartment the following week. They had discussed its future, whether Henry should take it with him or whether it should continue its journey through Cleveland's charity network to help someone else facing a difficult winter. The decision felt significant, representing not just practical considerations, but philosophical questions about ownership, continuity, and the nature of gifts that keep giving. Henry expressed his desire to keep the coat, not for warmth, since he could now afford adequate winter clothing, but as a reminder of the unexpected connections that could emerge from the most unlikely encounters. He wanted to remember the night when a stranger's cruelty had transformed into kindness, when coincidence had revealed deeper patterns of human interconnection that usually remained invisible. The coat represented hope that small acts of generosity could create positive change in ways that transcended time and distance. Rachel supported his decision wholeheartedly, recognizing that the coat had found its proper home with someone who understood and appreciated its significance. Her mother's long-ago act of charity had come full circle, creating benefits that extended far beyond its original purpose of keeping one child warm during one difficult winter. The coat had become a vehicle for adult transformation, teaching lessons about empathy, resilience, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the humanity in every person. On Henry's last night in the guest room, They sat together looking out at the Cleveland skyline, lights twinkling in the darkness like earthbound stars. The city spread below them, containing millions of individual stories of struggle and triumph, loss and recovery, chance encounters that changed everything, and simple kindnesses that rippled outward in ways that could never be fully tracked or measured. Somewhere in that urban landscape, other people were facing the kinds of challenges that had brought both Rachel and Henry to their breaking points, waiting for their own unexpected moments of grace. Rachel thought about the person she had been just a few months earlier, successful but isolated, professionally accomplished, but personally disconnected from the values that had shaped her childhood. Meeting Henry had reminded her that achievement without compassion was incomplete, that the security she had worked so hard to build could become a fortress that protected her from meaningful human connection as much as it shielded her from financial vulnerability. Henry reflected on his own transformation from the night he had first worn the brown coat, grateful for its warmth but unaware of the story it carried. Learning about Rachel's childhood connection to the garment had given new meaning to his experience of homelessness, helping him understand his situation as part of a larger human narrative rather than an isolated personal failure. Their friendship had restored his faith in the possibility of genuine connection across social boundaries, proving that circumstances didn't have to define the depth or value of relationships. As they prepared to say goodbye to this chapter of their acquaintance, both Rachel and Henry understood that their connection would continue beyond the practical arrangement that had brought them together. They had become genuine friends, bound by shared experience and mutual respect rather than temporary convenience. The brown coat had served its purpose as catalyst and symbol, but their relationship had developed its own foundation that would persist regardless of where the coat traveled next. The following morning, Rachel helped Henry load his belongings into her car for the drive to his new apartment. The brown coat was carefully folded in one of his boxes, ready to continue its role in his life as both practical garment and meaningful reminder. As they drove through Cleveland's winter morning, sharing observations about the city and planning future meetings, both of them felt the satisfaction that comes from having participated in something larger than individual survival or success. At Henry's new apartment, Rachel helped him carry boxes upstairs and expressed genuine happiness about his return to independent housing. The space was modest but clean and safe, with good light and proximity to public transportation that would make his commute to work manageable. As Henry unpacked and began arranging his possessions, Rachel could see him taking ownership of the space, creating a home that reflected his personality and hopes for the future. Before leaving, Rachel made Henry promise to stay in touch, to call if he needed anything, and to remember that their friendship had value beyond the circumstances that had created it. Henry made similar promises, expressing gratitude not just for the temporary housing she had provided, but for the more important gift of treating him with dignity and respect during a period when such treatment had been rare in his experience. Walking back to her car, Rachel felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The immediate chapter of their story was ending, but she sensed that their connection would continue evolving in new directions. The brown coat had accomplished something remarkable, transforming a moment of casual cruelty into an opportunity for mutual growth and understanding. Her mother's simple act of sewing a child's name into a donated garment had created ripples that were still expanding, still generating positive change in ways that would probably never be fully comprehended. Driving back to her apartment, Rachel thought about the weekend visit to her mother that was now just days away. The prospect no longer filled her with dread, but with genuine curiosity about reconnecting with her family and childhood community. She planned to tell her mother about Henry in detail, to share how the brown coat had continued serving others and had ultimately led to personal transformations that her mother could never have anticipated when she made the decision to donate rather than discard. That evening, alone in her apartment for the first time in weeks, Rachel called Henry to see how his first day in the new place was progressing. Their conversation was comfortable and natural, filled with the kind of details and observations that characterized established friendships. The brown coat, Henry reported, was hanging in his new closet, ready for whatever winter weather Cleveland might provide, while continuing to serve as a tangible reminder of unexpected grace. As the weeks passed, Rachel and Henry settled into a friendship that functioned independently of the housing arrangement that had initially sustained it. They met regularly for dinner or coffee, attended community events together, and maintained the kind of consistent contact that had been missing from both their lives before their chance encounter. Their relationship provided both practical and emotional benefits, creating stability and meaning that enhanced their individual efforts to build satisfying futures. Rachel's visit with her mother exceeded her expectations, leading to honest conversations about family history, personal choices, and the ways that success and struggle could both shape and sometimes distort relationships between generations. Her mother expressed amazement at the brown coat's continued journey, seeing it as confirmation of her long-held belief that small acts of kindness could create positive change in ways that transcended individual understanding or control. The story of the coat and the friendship it had catalyzed became a family legend, shared during holiday gatherings and phone conversations as evidence of the mysterious ways that generosity could circle back to bless both giver and receiver. Rachel's renewed connection with her family created additional layers of meaning and support in her life, contributing to a sense of completeness that her professional achievements alone had never provided. Spring arrived in Cleveland with its usual drama of sudden warmth and returning green, transforming the urban landscape and creating new possibilities for outdoor activities and community engagement. Rachel and Henry celebrated the change of seasons by taking long walks through the city's neighborhoods, observing how the same streets that had seemed hostile during winter could become welcoming and full of life as temperatures moderated and people emerged from indoor hibernation. The brown coat was carefully stored in Henry's closet, waiting for next winter's need, while serving year-round as a reminder of the transformative power of human connection. Its presence in Henry's life had become less about physical warmth and more about emotional security, representing his faith in the fundamental goodness of people despite evidence that might suggest otherwise. For Rachel, knowing that Henry still treasured the coat provided ongoing satisfaction about her mother's long-ago decision to donate rather than discard. As summer approached, both Rachel and Henry had established new patterns of living that incorporated the lessons they had learned from each other and from their unexpected meeting. Rachel's work remained demanding and important, but it was now balanced by meaningful relationships and community involvement that gave her life depth and connection beyond professional achievement. Henry's job had led to advancement opportunities and financial stability, but more importantly, it had restored his sense of purpose and contribution to the larger community. Their friendship continued to evolve and deepen, providing both with perspectives and support that enriched their individual journeys, while creating shared experiences that would bind them together regardless of future changes in their circumstances. The brown coat had served as more than catalyst for their connection. It had become symbol of the way that acts of generosity could create bonds across time and social boundaries, proving that human kindness was indeed a force capable of generating positive change in ways that could never be fully predicted or measured. On a warm evening in June, As they sat together on the patio of a restaurant near Lake Erie, watching the sun set over the water while boats moved slowly across the horizon, both Rachel and Henry felt grateful for the series of coincidences and choices that had brought them to this moment of contentment and friendship. The brown coat rested in Henry's closet, no longer needed for warmth, but treasured for its role in creating one of the most meaningful relationships either of them had ever experienced. Cleveland spread around them in all directions, containing millions of individual stories and thousands of daily opportunities for kindness or cruelty, connection or isolation. Somewhere in that urban landscape, other people were facing the kinds of challenges that had once seemed overwhelming to both Rachel and Henry, waiting for their own moments of unexpected grace. The brown coat had taught them both that such moments were always possible, that human generosity could indeed create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond the original act of kindness. As evening settled over the lake and the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, Rachel and Henry continued their conversation about work and family, plans and hopes, the daily details that comprised their lives and the larger dreams that gave those details meaning and direction. Their friendship had become one of the fundamental sources of joy and stability in both their lives, proof that the most important connections could emerge from the most unlikely encounters when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the shared humanity that connected all their individual stories. The brown coat waited in Henry's closet for next winter's need, ready to provide warmth and comfort while carrying forward the story of generosity and connection it had helped create. Its journey from Rachel's childhood, through decades of service, to Cleveland's homeless community, and finally to its role in catalyzing their friendship, demonstrated the mysterious ways that objects could become vehicles for human transformation when handled with love and respect by people who understood their deeper significance.